Hey there friends, glad to be back today. And today I want to deep dive on what happens when you're raised by a narcissistic parent or parents and how that directly affects your life. I did a previous video here on YouTube on the 19 possible signs of a narcissistic parent. And if you haven't seen that video, you may want to watch that first or watch that after this video. The link is in the description below. And by the way, give us a like on this video if this video is helpful or clarifying for you in any way, because it also helps us to understand that this video has helped and has also illuminated the situation and how and what we were trying to do by creating this video in the first place. Okay, so let's start deep diving on what happens when you're raised by a narcissist or both parents are narcissists and how that directly affects your life as an adult now. The first major impact that I see is the indecision and second guessing of yourself. You know, as an adult that was a child of a narcissistic parent or parents, you know, we fear and we get scared of hurting someone by doing what's right for ourselves. Right? So we need to do things that are right for ourselves, but we're scared of doing it because we don't want to hurt anybody else. But because we've been trained to take care of the parents first, right? So that you've been trained to take care of the parents first, you've been trained to take care of their needs first. And so it's hard for you to consider your own needs, right? It's hard to consider your own needs without feeling selfish or bad about considering those. And so that indecision and guilt can also be paralyzing in the situation. So you're scared of considering what you need to do. When you think about what you need to do and what's better for you, you start feeling bad. You start feeling guilt or shame for even thinking about it. And then you get stuck because you really need to make a decision, but you don't and can't because of the indecision based on the fear of how that's going to impact other people. And all that goes back to the idea as when you were growing up, your parents' needs came first, not yours. The second indication that I find that's very interesting is the concept of gaslighting. When you are being raised by a narcissistic parent, there's a tendency of them gaslighting you. And there's a tendency of you internalizing the gaslighting. So you're not seeing what's really happening, you're internalizing it and feeling guilt and questioning yourself, because gaslighting is about making someone doubt themselves. Doubt what they saw, doubt their memory of the situation or what happened. And as you were growing up, there might have been many times where your parent denied what happened. And in the process of denying what happened or what they did, they invalidate you, they invalidate your truth, they invalidate your feelings, and they invalidate the event. And I have multiple videos on gaslighting here on YouTube, and in the description you'll find those links and you can watch them. It's about gaslighting, gaslighting's impact, what gaslighting is. And so this can be a very interesting thing because when we've learned to internalize this gaslighting and we didn't really know what it was when we were growing up, we had no title for it or name, we might find ourselves now in relationships where we are being gaslit and internalizing that as well. And it might seem pretty commonplace because you had to do it a lot when you were growing up. The third thing that I find very interesting is that being raised by a narcissistic parent or parents can cause a person to have the imposter syndrome. And the imposter syndrome to me is very interesting because you can be the most successful, the wisest person, the most educated person on the planet, and you can still feel like an imposter when you're doing things. And I've done many videos that are here on YouTube, the links are in the description below, of the imposter syndrome and what that is. And basically, it's about you don't feel like you deserve successes. You don't feel like you're good enough to have the successes that you have. You don't even feel like you're good enough to be in the place that you're in or the title that you have. You feel like you're going to be exposed as a phony or a fraud at any time, even though that's not the case at all. But being in this environment growing up, you question yourself so much. There was a lot of indecision, a lot of second guessing, a lot of gaslighting, a lot of walking on eggshells, not knowing what to do, kind of tippy-toeing around their emotions. And so that can all make us feel like we're not good enough. And even if we've done all the work and we have all the knowledge, we still feel like somebody might expose us. Another indication that I find is very interesting by being raised by these narcissistic parents is that setting boundaries feels really impossible. It feels really impossible to set boundaries with your parents, like as an adult now. You might not even want to be around them that much, but you can't seem to set those boundaries, or you have a fear of not being around. And a lot of that is because of the manipulation as you were growing up. But also setting boundaries in other relationships is very tedious or hard or impossible, because remember, this was our biggest relationship, most important relationship that took up all of our time. As a child, these were our parents. They were like gods when we were born. They were huge beings, right? And so we looked up to them because they're our parents. And so if they didn't have any boundaries with us and we were an extension of them, we weren't taught about boundaries at all. And so when we try to place boundaries, we can feel really yucky or bad or guilty or shameful for not giving into them or caring about their emotions, even though they don't really care about our emotions and they don't have any empathy for us as well. And so basically what we're doing is hurting ourselves in the process, but we just keep giving and giving till it hurts because that's what we've done our whole life. Another effect that I found is that we have focused on our parents' needs all this time. And because they're always the biggest one in the room, they're the most important one in the room. It was all about, how do we function around them and help them to achieve their goals, or how do we help them deal with their emotions. And so usually you're going to find, or most people as an adult finds a relationship or a spouse or a significant other that has some of these similarities. So you might feel as though you've married an extension of your parent as far as it's all about them. They're holding court. It's about their emotions. Your emotions come second. If you bring up your emotions, they might tell you to be quiet or calm down or you're out of line or let's talk about that later. And so this might seem very kind of uncomfortably comfortable because this is what you've dealt with in the past. Another effect that the narcissistic parent has on us as an adult is that we meet a lot of people, or we interact with a lot of people, or we have relationships with multiple people that are emotionally unavailable and self-centered. And the reason for that is when you were growing up, whichever parent or both parents who had those narcissistic signs and symptoms was emotionally unavailable for you. Okay, and in that process, when you had an issue or problem, you didn't have anybody to really nurture you. You turned inside and you turned the blame inside to you, because what happens is if we have nobody to help us, we try to figure out what's wrong with us. We turn the blame in because that's the only person we can blame. And as a child, we find all these reasons why we must have done something wrong, that our parent's not there. So we internalize the blame because it's the only blame we can make, because if we try to blame them, they're not going to listen to it anyway. And so I find that we find other emotionally unavailable people because we're used to that and used to kind of placating that or being codependent with that. And unfortunately, that's unhealthy, but it can be a slippery slope if you've been around emotionally unavailable parents growing up. Another major effect that I see when people are raised by narcissistic parents is that insecure attachment and that codependency. That insecure attachment is very important to notice because of the neglect that was involved, because remember, it was the parents' needs that came first. They were not emotionally available. There was a lot of manipulation and gaslighting to get what the parent wanted. There was emotional absence. They weren't emotionally available. And so all those things lead to that. Because we become codependent in nature, and that can be very important to understand, because when that happens, that can impact us for the rest of our lives, which it does. The people that we choose to have relationships with, the friends that we choose to spend time with. But it can also create somebody to be super clingy and needy because they're needing to have those needs met. They haven't, and they're just, they're dying to have those needs met. On the flip side, you could have somebody that's extremely independent. They create this extreme independence because they don't trust anybody. So there's a fear there because their needs weren't met as a child, so they create that wall. And so that's where you can see the extreme differences. And so if you're dealing with that, you can understand that this is a product of being raised by somebody that wasn't there, was neglectful, and also who was emotionally absent. Another effect that I see is egoism. And egoism is a very interesting aspect when we think about it, because an egoist fears being a narcissist completely. Doesn't want to be anything like their narcissistic parents at all. And so the fear there as an egoist is very interesting because they fear taking attention from the narcissist, taking the attention or the spotlight off the narcissist. And that comes from being raised in that dynamic where as a child you want to take up as little space as possible. You want to be as small as you can to avoid any triggering or any emotional outbursts from the parent dynamic. And so you learn that growing up. You try to take up very little space, try not to talk very much, not say a lot of things because you're trying to go underneath the radar. You don't want to encourage any sort of emotional outburst or argumentation. And so you'll also find that in your relationship could be in your current relationship if you find yourself doing that, not wanting to trigger the other person, walking very, very, very gently, just hoping to kind of get around people to not create any sort of that aspect. And that can be very problematic because you're probably not talking about your needs, you're probably not talking about your wants or desires, and you're probably holding a lot of things in that's causing probably some resentment and anger, but you're doing this because you don't want to create those outbursts, and you learn that being raised in this narcissistic environment. Another effect that you'll find being in a family dynamic, being raised by a narcissist or multiple narcissists, is that you focus on other people's happiness and needs first. Your happiness becomes other people's happiness, not your own. And so you're constantly trying to feed them, help them do. And that's great that you want to help them and take care of things. But again, it comes at your own expense. Your needs come last. And that eventually causes resentment and anger. And it also becomes a problem because your needs don't get met. And that also transforms not only as a child, but into your adult life, into your marriage, and into your friendships. And last but not least, that I find is very interesting is that when you're raised in this dynamic, you blame yourself for certain outcomes. You blame yourself for any problem because the other person is never to blame. The other person does not take responsibility, and the other person doesn't apologize. So when you're growing up, you don't realize what you're dealing with, and you just assume, okay, I must take the blame because I must be the one at fault, even though you probably weren't. And so we have to be really careful with that too as we're adults, is that how often are you taking the blame for things that you didn't do? So as we see, when we're raised by a narcissistic parent or both parents being narcissists, it really does affect our life. It affects us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and it has lasting effects on us. And so when we begin to understand this, we can begin to see patterns in our life. We can begin to see choices that we've made based on the situation of being raised in that dynamic, and we can begin to make some changes. We can begin to speak up for ourselves, and we can begin to see where this has caused kind of a breakdown in our life. And I think this is really extremely important to recognize, because when you are raised by narcissistic parents, you didn't get the handbook. As a child, nobody said, hey, your mom or dad or both of them are narcissists. You had no idea. They were just your parents. And so when we really dig deep into this is important. And I hear a lot of clients say, oh, well, my parents and I are good now. We're working on it now. And that's great. But as a child, it impacted you to a great degree. Even as a young adult, it did. And you might be getting along more now, but the impact of what they did to you had massive impact on your life. And so it's just grasping the idea, understanding the impact, and beginning to see the patterns you may be dealing with in your life, and start looking at it and illuminating, seeing ways that you can get your needs met, ways that you can be more decisive, ways that you can feel more comfortable and more comfortable in your own skin. Very important things to think about. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us understand that we're doing something that you like the content that we're putting out there. Also, give us a like on this video if this video has, shined some light, inspired, or helped you to see some things in your life that's necessary. And in the comments section, let me know, are there other things that were affected by living with a narcissist? Are there other aspects of your life, emotionally or physically, that I left out of this list? Because I'm sure there's a lot of them, but I wanted to cover as many as possible. But I think we need to get knowledge out there, because anybody that's been raised by a narcissistic parent knows the impact, or is recognizing the impact, and wants to really understand it so they can get a firm grasp on necessary changes and things that can be augmented to start living the life that they deserve. In the meantime, don't forget to live your true life.